At exactly 6 a.m., I shot awake to a blaring alarm, the sound of screeching tires and blinding flashes of red and white lights bouncing off my bedroom walls. I stumbled to the window, heart hammering in my chest, and what I saw looked like the opening scene of a military raid. Armed personnel moved with precision, barking commands through radios as they secured the street. But that wasn't the part that hit hardest. The real gut punch? My Jeep, the very same one I had locked and parked exactly where the Army task force had instructed, was gone. Vanished. In its place sat a solitary, bright orange parking cone and a sticky note that read, "Got violatin hua confit." Yeah, you can probably guess what happened next. As I stood there, my mind raced with disbelief and fury. The scene wasn't a clerical error or a simple misunderstanding. It was a calculated move by someone I'd come to loathe, the infamous HOA, Karen. Somehow, she had broken my lock and commandeered my Jeep, completely oblivious to one critical detail, that it was under the protection of an active Army task force. In that surreal moment, my life, normally governed by routine and responsibility, turned into a battlefield. The orderly world of suburban property rights was suddenly clashing with the iron resolve of military protection and the unyielding spirit of a state trooper. Karen's aggressive enforcement of community standards had taken a personal turn, and as I watched the flashing lights recede down the street, I knew that I was about to set things right, by any means necessary. This was my wake-up call and the spark for my ultimate response. Today, Karen would learn the high price of overstepping her authority. I wasn't going to let her petty vendetta against a humble Jeep define my day or my property rights. I vowed that by the time the dust settled, she would regret every minute she spent meddling with my stuff. And trust me, the retaliation I had planned wasn't going to be subtle. Crestview Meadows was a gated community known for its pristine lawns, uniform houses, and a strict set of rules enforced by an ever-watchful homeowners association. Every resident was expected to maintain a flawless appearance, and any deviation from the norm was met with swift, often draconian, action. It was a place where order reigned supreme, and none of that was more evident than in the actions of one relentless enforcer, HOA Karen Miller. Karen, in her early 50s and impeccably dressed in tailored blouses and sensible skirts, had become a fixture in Crestview Meadows. With her clipboard always at hand and her smartphone glued to her ear, she roamed the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff. Known for her unwavering adherence to the HOA's often arbitrary guidelines, Karen was infamous for issuing fines and reprimands for even the smallest infractions, whether it was a mismatched flower pot or a mailbox that wasn't perfectly aligned. To her, conformity was not just preferable, it was essential for maintaining community standards. I, on the other hand, was a longtime resident who prided myself on living life on my own terms. I had inherited a modest but spirited homestead on the edge of Crestview Meadows, a property that I had transformed into a working farm and personal haven. My Jeep was not just a mode of transportation. It was a symbol of independence and resilience. I worked hard, maintained my property meticulously, and always believed that individuality should be celebrated, not stifled by overly rigid rules. Life on my farm was a blend of tradition and progress. I employed modern techniques to keep my crops thriving, installed eco-friendly systems for water and power, and even maintained a small collection of animals that roamed freely across the fields. The beauty of my homestead lay in its authenticity, a sharp contrast to the cookie-cutter perfection mandated by the HOA. My Jeep, parked in a designated spot that complied with every regulation, was a source of pride and a reminder of the freedom I had fought to preserve. Yet, in the meticulous world of Crestview Meadows, my independent streak was a thorn in Karen's side. Over the years, she had fine after fine issued to me for unauthorized modifications and other minor deviations from her narrow interpretation of what our community should look like. I had learned to ignore her petty complaints until the day she took a drastic step that crossed every line, breaking my lock to seize my Jeep. The community was divided. Some admired my refusal to simply comply with arbitrary rules. Others were too afraid of incurring Karen's wrath to speak out. But one thing was clear. Karen's actions were no longer just about enforcing rules. They were an affront to the very concept of individual property rights. The fact that she didn't even realize my Jeep was protected by an Army task force only added a bitter twist to the whole ordeal. As the morning of the incident unfolded into chaos, I was determined to reclaim not just my Jeep, but the dignity of my independence. The stage had been set for a showdown, a clash between the overreaching authority of an HOA enforcer and the unyielding spirit of a man who believed in the right to live freely and fiercely. And I was ready to fight for what was mine. In the aftermath of that surreal morning, anger and frustration rippled through my veins. I immediately contacted the local authorities to report the theft, but I knew deep down that Karen's actions were more than just a criminal offense. They were a blatant challenge to my independence and a mockery of everything I stood for as a state trooper. I began compiling every shred of evidence. Timestamped security footage showing her furtive movements near my Jeep, detailed logs from the Army Task Force protection system confirming unauthorized access, and even testimonies from a couple of neighbors who had seen her lurking near the property. As I gathered the evidence, I also reached out to fellow residents on community forums and local social media groups. The response was swift and vindicating. Many share their own stories of overzealous fines and arbitrary enforcement by the HOA. Hashtags like hashtag property rights and hashtag no more Karen quickly emerged online, rallying a growing chorus of support. I could feel the tide turning as more people began to question the HOA's priorities and the unchecked authority of Karen Miller. I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, detailing the events of that morning and attaching the evidence I collected. I demanded immediate action, a full investigation into her conduct, and the imposition of sanctions against her for what was clearly a gross abuse of power. The board's initial response was tepid, a classic case of, "We're looking into it," and I knew that I couldn't wait for bureaucracy to resolve a matter that affected my very livelihood and independence. Determined to make a statement and to reclaim my dignity, I resolved to take matters into my own hands. As a state trooper, I was trained to be resourceful and decisive, and I decided that if Karen didn't return my Jeep promptly, I would initiate a countermeasure that would leave no doubt as to who was ultimately in charge. I knew that the Army task force protecting my vehicle was a critical asset, and the fact that Karen was so blissfully unaware of it was my advantage. I began by coordinating with a trusted friend in law enforcement who was familiar with the task force's protocols. Together, we verified every detail of my Jeep's security system. The system, designed to alert authorities at the slightest hint of tampering, had recorded Karen's unauthorized access and flagged it as an extreme breach of protocol. The digital logs were irrefutable, and I secured copies to add to my dossier. I even managed to confirm that the protective measures in place were fully operational, meaning that any further tampering would trigger immediate alerts to both military personnel and local police. My plan was simple. If Karen thought she could bypass the law by stealing my Jeep, she would soon learn that my property was safeguarded not just by private security, but by the full weight of state power. I prepared a public statement that outlined the events and my next steps, and I posted on community forums, urging neighbors to stand with me. Property isn't just a privilege, it's a right, I wrote. If you mess with my land, you mess with the law. The statement resonated deeply. Support poured in from every corner of the community, and soon my phone was lit up with messages of solidarity. At the same time, I knew that the HOA board would eventually have to address Karen's blatant abuse of power. I organized a meeting with several local residents and activists, all of whom had grown tired of the persistent overreach by the HOA enforcers. We drafted a petition demanding that the board not only sanction Karen Miller, but also implement stricter oversight on all property interventions. This petition quickly amassed thousands of signatures, turning what began as a personal vendetta into a community-wide movement. Every hour that passed increased the tension. My digital dossier, brimming with evidence and impassioned support, was now a beacon of resistance. I anticipated that Karen would try to cover her tracks or issue a feeble apology, but I was prepared for every possible scenario. My resolve was clear. I would not rest until my Jeep and the dignity of all property rights in our community was restored. In the days that followed the morning's shocking events, the story of my missing Jeep and Karen's blatant theft exploded across social media. Videos of the security footage, complete with timestamps and detailed annotations of every unauthorized entry, were shared widely among the residents of Crestview Meadows. Hashtags such as hashtag #NoMoreKaren, hashtag property rights, and hashtag Jeep Justice rapidly trended locally, uniting a community long oppressed by arbitrary fines and overzealous enforcement. Local news outlets seized the story, driving by my property and capturing the aura of defiance that now hung over my homestead. Reporters interviewed neighbors who recounted their own experiences with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, and I found myself at the center of a burgeoning movement against bureaucratic tyranny. This isn't just about one Jeep, one local anchor declared. It's about standing up for every resident's right to live without fear of arbitrary interference. The media frenzy painted a vivid picture of a community ready to reclaim its independence. Meanwhile, the HOA board was thrown into turmoil. Emergency meetings were convened behind closed doors, and heated discussions erupted among board members. Leaked emails revealed a deep fissure. Some members defended Karen's actions as necessary to maintain order, while others condemned the personal vendetta that had led to my Jeep's confiscation. The board's internal conflict was mirrored on social platforms, where residents passionately debated whether property rights should be subordinate to the HOA's outdated rules. The digital petitions I spearheaded gained thousands of signatures and became a rallying cry for those who believe that personal property should be sacrosanct. Karen Miller's response was a blend of desperation and defiance. In a series of hastily recorded videos posted on her social media channels, she attempted to justify her actions, insisting that her intervention was meant to uphold community standards. "I am protecting our neighborhood," she cried, her voice cracking under pressure. But every time she tried to spin her narrative, the evidence, security footage, digital logs, and police reports spoke louder. Her overblown claims were unequivocally debunked by the factual data, and public opinion began to sway sharply against her. I took every opportunity to update my online community. Through live streams and detailed blog posts, I shared the latest developments. The latest report from the Army Task Force confirming that my Jeep was fully secured, the digital logs that underscored Karen's repeated breaches, and testimonials from supportive neighbors. My messages were simple and resolute. Our property rights matter. Mess with my land, and you mess with the law. The overwhelming support from fellow residents, emails, texts, comments on social media, further emboldened me, turning my personal quest for justice into a community-wide movement. As the controversy reached its apex, the HOA board, under mounting public pressure, announced that a final public hearing would be held to address this blatant abuse of power and to determine the future of property enforcement policies in Crestview Meadows. The announcement was met with a mixture of relief and determination from the residents. Neighbors organized peaceful rallies outside the community center, carrying banners that read, "Our property, our rights, and no more Karen." Every shared video clip and every hashtag added to the roar demanding accountability. On the day of the hearing, the community center was packed with residents, some carrying proof of their own grievances, others there simply to support the cause. The atmosphere was tense, charged with raw emotion and the anticipation of a turning point. I could feel that this was the moment when the overwhelming digital evidence, the impassioned voices of our neighbors, and the undeniable truth of my plight would force the HOA board to confront the harsh reality of arbitrary rule enforcement. Every conversation, every social media post, and every whispered comment around town reinforced a single message. If the HOA board did not act to protect our property rights, they would forever lose the trust of the community. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, one that would reshape the power dynamics in Crestview Meadows and serve as a reminder that every resident's right to live and work freely was non-negotiable. The decisive moment came on a cool, brisk morning in a packed boardroom at the Crestview Meadows Community Center. The room buzzed with energy as HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and hundreds of determined residents gathered for the final public hearing that would decide the fate of our neighborhood's enforcement policies. With an unwavering presence and a steady gaze, Councilwoman Melissa Carter took to the podium. Her voice, calm yet resolute, cut through the murmur of anticipation. After an exhaustive review of all digital evidence, including time-stamped security footage, detailed access logs, and the impassioned testimonies of our residents, we have reached an inescapable conclusion, she began. It is abundantly clear that the actions taken by Mrs. Karen Miller, specifically her unauthorized seizure of private property by breaking my lock to confiscate my Jeep, were not motivated by any legitimate concern for our community, but were driven by personal bias and a flagrant abuse of power. Our community's rights as property owners must be upheld, and no one should impose their will on another through arbitrary enforcement. A heavy silence fell over the room as Councilwoman Carter continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all fines and sanctions related to this incident, and we will launch a comprehensive disciplinary review of all practices that allowed such overreach. We will also implement new guidelines that unequivocally protect every resident's right to manage their own property. Today's decision is not just about rectifying a single wrongful act. It is a resounding declaration that Crestview Meadows will not tolerate the oppression of personal freedoms by any individual, regardless of their self-appointed authority. Her words resonated powerfully, and a chorus of approval swept through the assembly. At that moment, a respected community advocate rose to speak. "Today, we stand united," he declared, his voice ringing with determined passion. "No resident should ever fear that their hard-earned property rights will be trampled by petty vendettas. Let this vote be the turning point, a clear signal that our community values innovation, independence, and the sanctity of private life above all else. We demand accountability and will not rest until every violation of our rights is met with swift, decisive action." His declaration was met with resounding applause, uniting everyone present in a single, powerful call for justice. Following his address, a senior officer from the local task force presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of all digital evidence, expert analyses, and official reports confirming that my Jeep was indeed under Army Task Force protection and that Karen's actions were a clear abuse of power. The evidence was irrefutable, and the Internal Affairs panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures against those responsible for her unauthorized actions. The full report was slated for immediate public release, ensuring complete transparency. Councilwoman Carter concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Crestview Meadows, a community where every resident's rights are honored and where public authority is exercised with fairness and integrity. Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we will protect our freedoms and that no one, regardless of their position, can impose their personal vendettas on us. Together, we stand for justice, accountability, and the inalienable right to live, work, and travel without fear of arbitrary interference." Her final words, delivered with unyielding conviction, sealed the turning point in our struggle for property rights and personal freedom. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of the community forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Crestview Meadows. The era of petty, arbitrary enforcement was over, and a future built on respect for individual rights was finally within our grasp. In the weeks following that historic vote, Crestview Meadows underwent a profound transformation. News of the rescinded fines and the sweeping reforms enacted by the HOA board spread rapidly throughout local media and online forums, igniting impassioned debates about property rights, community governance, and the sanctity of individual freedom. Editorials in the neighborhood newspaper, with headlines such as "A New Dawn for Crestview Meadows" and "Community United for Justice," celebrated the decisive action taken to protect every resident's right to manage their own property without fear of arbitrary interference. Hashtags like hashtag property rights, hashtag no more bullying, and hashtag freedom first trended widely, reinforcing our collective resolve. Town hall meetings and community forums saw record attendance as residents came together to share their personal stories of struggle under the old regime and to envision a future where creativity and independence were not stifled. Neighbors, who once lived in quiet fear of punitive fines and relentless inspections, now spoke with pride about their right to live on their own terms. Our homes, our farms, our vehicles, these are our sanctuaries, declared one impassioned resident at a bustling meeting, his words echoing powerfully through the packed room. The atmosphere was charged with hope, a promise that Crestview Meadows would forever stand as a beacon of individual rights and innovation. Within the reformed HOA board and local task force, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, launched comprehensive training programs emphasizing ethical conduct, cultural sensitivity, and the responsible management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established to ensure that every complaint was thoroughly examined and that no resident would ever again be subjected to arbitrary fines or abuse of power. Our duty is to protect the rights and dignity of every member of our community, Lieutenant Reed affirmed in a follow-up press conference, reinforcing the renewed commitment to fairness and accountability. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations also mobilized further to empower residents. Workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns were organized to raise awareness about property rights and creative freedom, encouraging a united front against any future overreach. When we stand together, no one can steal our voice or our rights, a local activist proclaimed at one of these gatherings, inspiring neighbors to join in the fight for a more equitable community. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and transformative. My decision to stand up against HOA Karen's blatant abuse of power, and to do so by leveraging the protection of the Army Task Force and making a public statement against her overreach, had not only reclaimed my Jeep and my dignity, but also sparked a movement for justice throughout Crestview Meadows. Neighbors who had long endured the oppressive rule of an overzealous enforcer found their voices. The digital evidence that exposed Karen's misdeeds became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the sanctity of individual property and the right to live freely. Karen Miller, once the unchallenged enforcer of the HOA's draconian policies, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a vivid reminder that no one is above accountability when the community unites for justice. Her influence dwindled rapidly as digital records of her past transgressions were circulated widely, leaving no doubt that a new era of fairness had dawned. At a final celebratory event in the Central Park of Crestview Meadows, residents, local officials, and advocates gathered beneath the gentle glow of the setting sun. A large banner reading "Unity, Freedom, and Property Rights" was unfurled between towering oak trees, and heartfelt speeches echoed with promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate the victory of our rights over arbitrary enforcement, a victory for every resident who believes in living freely and creatively, Councilwoman Carter proclaimed, her voice ringing with unwavering determination. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our collective commitment to protect our freedoms and ensure that never again would a petty enforcer dictate our lives. As each new day dawned over Crestview Meadows, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how HOA Karen Miller's attempt to confiscate my Jeep was met with a bold, decisive response, and how it spurred a community-wide movement for property rights and individual dignity, became a rallying cry for every resident. Every sunrise now carried with it the promise that in Crestview Meadows, truth, justice, and personal freedom would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to safeguard our rights against any future bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Crestview Meadows would forever be a place where creativity, integrity, and respect for individual property shone brighter than any enforced conformity.